Hello everyone, Loremaster of Sotek here, back with another Q&A, which I seem to be completely incapable of getting them out when I want to get them out. But we're here, that's all that matters. And I'm going to be answering every question that we had show up in the various places I looked for them. So if your question isn't on here, then you didn't ask it somewhere for me to find it. But in any event, we do have a lot of questions, so without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Our first question comes from McFeary, who asks, how do the Beastmen acquire their weapons and armor? Are they just slapped together from materials stolen from raided towns? Or do the Beastmen have some primitive understanding of metallurgy? So the Beastmen acquire all of their materials from raiding and looting rather than creating anything themselves. Whenever returning to the Dark Forest with their spoils of war, all weapons and armor are dumped in massive piles before the great Herd Stones, which act as rally points and sacred sites for the Children of Chaos. The strongest Beastmen get first pick when selecting armaments from the loot piles, and will essentially just gather a random assortment of weapons and armor. When it comes to the like of Bestigors, who wear full plate, they will grab pieces of armor and proceed to just smash them with hoof and fist until it roughly fits their body. Ungors do possess enough dexterity to create some fairly crude weaponry, but when I say crude, I'm literally talking about tying sinew or rope around some materials, like just lashing two things together to make a type of weapon. But it's not very well made. It would be a very poor armament. But the thing to note is that Beastmen abhor all forms of civilization, so they don't possess any smiths of any kind. The closest thing they even have to crafters are those Beastmen who hollow out bones into horns or attach hides to banner poles. That's as complicated as they get. As for their magical items, the Beastmen tend to just claim or steal their equipment from races they've defeated, and then just saturate it in profane rituals until it's fully corrupted to their will, which will usually grant it some more interesting properties. But the only way you really see magical equipment come from Beastmen, which is the most complex thing they do, is usually shamans doing rituals and covering them in curses and such. But other than that, no, the Beastmen, they don't create anything. Everything they use is stolen from others. Our next question comes from Franny Boy, who asks, how do the Chaos Gods see the Beastmen? Are they forgotten like the Fimmer, or favored like the humans? Alright, so the Gods of Chaos fully recognize the Beastmen as their children, but quite frankly don't pay much attention to them. They're not forgotten or completely ignored like the Fimmer, but nor are they actively sought out and lavished upon like men. The Beastmen are already utterly enthralled and committed to chaos, so the Dark Brothers know they can focus on other affairs, and the Beastmen will continue to carry out their will. Everything the Beastmen do naturally pleases the Chaos Gods, so there's no reason for them to focus on the Beastmen. This is a major reason why the Beastmen hate the Warriors of Chaos so much. Seeing how the humans are favored and spoiled by their patrons riles up quite a bit of jealousy and hatred. For the Warriors of Chaos, whenever they have the gods' attention, they'll be given suits of armor and powerful demon weapons and immortality in the form of a demon prince. None of that's offered to the Beastmen, because those are basically used as enticements, because men have to decide to give their souls over to chaos. Beastmen are already doomed. They're already there. So they're not really worth as much. Like, they can get the attention of the gods, but the gods don't seek their attention, if that makes sense. That all being said, the Dark Gods are often quite pleased by the Beastmen's exploits, and when some notably devastating act occurs, their attention will be drawn to reward their champions. This is how we see unique types of Beastmen dedicated to a particular patron, like Korngors, Zongors, Slongors, and Pestigors, which, if you don't know, those are associated to Korn, Tzeentch, Slaanesh, and Nurgle. Most rewards for Beastmen tend to be mutations that increase their abilities. Very, very rarely will you see them get something like like one of their items being possessed by a demon, or some kind of physical gift. It's almost always mutation based. So hopefully that answers your question. Our third question comes from Cold Rage, who asks, I remember reading a long time ago that female beastmen act differently than the males. Is this supported anywhere, or just a fan theory of why we don't see them? Also, in the RPG, there's a story about a boy being lost in the woods where he finds a chaos shrine and a minotaur guarding it. The minotaur tells the boy to run off and grow stronger so he can fight him later. Is this a normal thing for beastmen? Most of what we see is them raising towns. Are there part of them that are slightly more civilized, if still very animalistic? So, okay, it's kind of a two-parter, and there's a lot of questions about female beastmen. So we're going to kind of hit on it hardest here, but we'll kind of touch on it again in some later questions. So, for female beastmen, they're kind of a footnote in beastmen lore, but they certainly do exist. They are called does, and they are fairly diminutive and shy compared to their male counterparts, and are notably more rare. It's not quite to the extent that you would see in, say, like the dwarves, who it's very rare for them to have daughters. I think it's like 1 in 4 or something like that. That being said, though, you won't find does rampaging in most Brayherds, but you'll instead find them at herdstones or beastmen camps or sacred sites where beastmen tend to stay. Like, there's usually always a beastman presence in those areas, found in the forest. That's not to say, however, that there aren't female creatures found in the war herds. Many mutants join alongside the beastmen, whether they were born by a human but adopted by the herd, which are so basically you were born by a human mother and father, but the baby had some form of mutation, was left out in the woods to die. The beastmen will claim that baby, and those are called gaves, which are very well treated by the herd and are raised by them. There are also, another way you would find warrior women, so to speak, in a herd would be turnskins, which are humans, so grown adults typically, or children, that gained a mutation that turned them into a beastman-like creature and they join a herd. Those are known as turnskins, and they are not treated well by the herds. Those particular individuals may turn out to be ferocious despite being female, but it's very unusual. It's definitely not the norm. And most Brayherds, if a female shows up, they're going to be designated for other activities. Does, which are pure beastmen that are female, are fairly rare, but going after them or hunting them is probably one of the most dangerous things you can do, because the war herds and the Brayherds defend them religiously. To go after them, would be the equivalent of trying to destroy a herdstone or something of the sort. It would be exceedingly dangerous. As for the Minotaur story, no, that's a very, very unusual encounter to be had with a beastman, especially a Minotaur in particular. That particular creature in the story, he is a guardian of a sacred site for those beastmen. He's the guardian of that herdstone, and he must have been a little bit mutated to be more intelligent than the average Minotaur. And also, that story existed in 6th edition, and 7th edition was the last edition we had for beastmen. But the older the editions got, beastmen kind of became even more ferocious and more bloodthirsty, and everything kind of became more dark as Warhammer progressed, and that included the beastmen. In 7th edition or 8th edition lore, there's no way that story would have occurred. Most beastmen lack any form of restraint and would be all too happy to gorge themselves by killing a child lost in the woods, which honestly would be the best case scenario for the kid, is being an easy kid's meal. If they were caught by like Ungors or something, their fate would be way worse, or Bray Shaman. Those are the worst to be caught by. Ungors because they're very, very cruel, and Bray Shamans because they, like to keep you around for rituals. A Gore or a Minotaur or a Vestigore, they'll just kill and eat you. It's the small ones and the Bray Shamans you got to worry about. But hopefully that'll answer that question, and we'll be touching on the female question a couple more times because a lot of people asked about that, so we'll come back to it. Let's go on to the next question. The Destroyer asks, why aren't Skaven considered beastmen? So Skaven are a specific species that long ago rapidly evolved from rats due to consuming warpstone and the manipulation of the great horned rat. They all share exceedingly common characteristics, a civilization and religion, which separates them immensely from the Beastmen. Beastmen are the ultimate antithesis of civilization. They hate all forms of it and seek nothing less than to return the world to a wild and primitive state known to them as the Endless Hunt. This means no cities, no technology, no governments. Obviously, the Skaven have all of those in spades, and thus the two races completely hate one another and are opposites in many ways. The only thing that really relates them is that they're both furry, and they both were born of chaos, but even then they were born in very different ways. As for physical features, Beastmen don't really share a truly common form, as what makes them Beastmen is that they are mutated humans. In their ranks, you'll find such absurd amounts of variation that it's mind-boggling. For the sake of ease, video games, models, and artwork don't tend to portray the Beastmen as chaotic looking as they are lore-wise, just because it would get ridiculous. The likes of Ungors, Gors, and Bestigors, for instance, aren't all goat-headed creatures, but may have all sorts of wild mutations and variations. The feature that determines their rank, for instance, is the size of their horns. So what separates an Ungor from a Gor from a Bestigor is almost always just their horns. That's really the only notable one. While the common feature that unites Beastmen is that they are mutated humanoids, or they were mutated from humans that have a hatred for civilization and humanity above all other things. And they also serve the Dark Brothers, the four main patron gods. Skaven, for instance, are wildly different. You know, they're the opposite of Beastmen in almost every way. You know, they worship the Great Horned Rat. They don't worship the four major powers. They don't even like the four major powers. You know, they are very ingenious and clever, which Beastmen are most certainly not. You know, Skaven design technology and diseases, and they do research, and they keep records, and they have a civilization and an empire and buildings and all this stuff that is so not what the Beastmen are into. They're very, very different creatures. You know, Skaven like to be underground, Beastmen like to be in the forest. They hate one another, and there's a ridiculous amount of wars that occur between the two races. They do not get along at all. But yeah, Skaven, what makes Skaven scary for humanity, for instance, and why the Empire often tries to play off the Skaven as Beastmen, is because Skaven are ingenious. You know, they have this advanced weaponry and machines and all sorts of other horrific creations, and they also have a worldwide spanning empire that lives just beneath everyone's feet. The reason the Empire doesn't officially acknowledge them is because that level of threat is so intense that they don't want people to know about it. Because if everyone knew that there was a nearly endless, like numbering in the billions, of vermin that lived just beneath their feet, who were sophisticated, intelligent, and had weapons that were far more advanced than their own, people would panic. There would be mass rioting. People would flee the cities, and you know, it would be very horrific to learn about, and a lot of people would despair and run out of their cities and God knows what. And also, if you acknowledge the existence of the Skaven, clever men realized that if you acknowledge the existence of the Skaven, then they are much more brazen to attack you. The Skaven don't tend to attack the Empire that often because they value the secretiveness of their existence. So they don't want to risk attacking very often, because if they were to do that, then it would be very open that they exist. Because in their mind, they're trying to avoid the Empire turning on them. While in the Empire's mind, they're trying to avoid the Skaven uniting into a single force with the single desire of destroying the Empire. You know, the dwarves acknowledge and realize the Skaven are a threat, and because of that, they have to deal with the Skaven on a much more regular basis. So that's kind of where that comes from, and that kind of leads to the confusion a lot of people have about why Skaven aren't Beastmen, is because of the whole Empire's propaganda that there's no such thing as Skaven, and that they are just Beastmen. But no, they're completely separate races or species, however you want to think of it. Hopefully that answers that question. Vane Warlord asks, I know that Beastmen in general are completely chaotic and tend to just attack anyone, but that there have also been occasions where they fought alongside Chaos-aligned humans. Is there any occurrence of Beastmen working together with anyone else besides that in Warhammer history? Not really. Most races are quite wary of Beastmen, as they hate all forms of civilization and attempt to tear it down wherever found. This has made them enemies with just about every race on the planet. Beastmen will often fight alongside the Warriors of Chaos in the greater name of defeating some mutual foe, and of course the Demons of Chaos have many times been summoned by the rituals of the Bray Shamans, especially like the Harbinger, who specializes in summoning Demons of Chaos to the battlefield, to aid the Children of Chaos on the battlefield, or Beastmen. Outside of that, there are occasional pacts struck with the Beast Lords by the likes of the Chaos Dwarves, but that has only happened a handful of times throughout history. And even then, most of the time that was due to a greater power, like a Warrior of Chaos at hand, rather than being a direct contact between the Chaos Dwarves and the Beastmen themselves. Of all the notable races in the Warhammer world, though, it's worth noting that the Beastmen are easily the least likely to work alongside anyone else. Joseph Karisturi asks, how rare are the Beastmen who do not have cow/goat heads, and are they stronger, or are the Minotaurs and Cygors the strongest? So they're not rare at all. There are so many random mutations among Beastmen that it would take me hours just to go through all the different kinds of heads they could have, much less all their other limbs. Just a few examples, for instance, are Bovigors and Caprigors. Those are like different subspecies of Beastmen just because they have different heads. That being said, the most powerful type of Beastmen are those known as Trugors. When we're talking about infantry size, we'll get bigger in a moment. Trugors have no mutations and are fairly pure in their appearance, besides bearing a strong set of horns. Some of them even have human legs, and the only mutation they have is their horns. These Trugors, however, are insanely rare, incredibly rare, which is lucky for the world at large, as Trugors are vastly superior both physically and mentally to other Beastmen. They will almost always end up taking over the Brayherd that they're born into, but like I said, they are exceedingly rare. As for pure physical strength, the strongest type of Beastman is the Gorgon, which Gorgons are cannibalistic Minotaurs that glutted themselves upon the flesh of other Minotaurs, Warpstone, and any other monster they could find in the forest, until they mutated into these immense four-armed monsters of horrific strength and size. I mean, we're talking a Minotaur, like started off regular Minotaur sized, that ate so much, especially of its own kin and other powerful creatures, that it constantly mutated and glutted until it became the size of a giant and grew additional arms. They are insanely powerful creatures. Thankfully, there's not a ton of them, and they're very hard to control. But when they do show up, they make a pretty significant impact, to say the least. Let's see here. Zarguz Headwaka asks, how are there such vast numbers of beastmen and large monsters able to hide from the other factions? Surely the other nations could just expand into the forest or send in expeditions to eradicate them. Alright, so if you have the ability to, you should go check out some of the forests in Europe here in our world and marvel at their just mind-boggling size. Keeping in mind that civilization in our world dwarfs that of the Warhammer world in size, there are still plenty of places to be found in 2018 where if I dropped you in the middle of a forest, you could walk for days and find no signs of human life. Now let's transfer that knowledge into a world where the forests of the old world dwarf the ones in our Europe, and fill the forest with monsters, spirits, and in some places elves that actively thwart all attempts of expansion. The lands of the Beastmen are often called the Empire within the Empire, or the Shadow of the Empire, because the towns, cities, and outposts of the Empire are mere flickers of light and civilization in a sea of darkness. That's how a race numbering in the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, like Beastmen, can hide in the forests. The scope of these forests is really difficult to explain in an easy way. As for the expeditions question, let's look at a few notable places in the Reichwald Forest. Let's say you wanted to expand a town a ways north of Altdorf, for instance. You may accidentally start felling trees that make up part of the sacred ground of the forest goblins, known as the Black Pit. In fact, this actually happened in lore. An army of Imperial soldiers in the thousands went to help expand those lands and protect the villages being built there. Unfortunately, the response was a massive wah of enraged forest goblins backed up by thousands of giant spider cavalry and a score of Arachnarok spiders hell-bent on protecting their sacred ground. It was a massacre. For the Empire's troops were fighting on unfamiliar territory in a dark and foreboding forest against an enemy that knew the lay of the land, just like Beastmen do, had troop types specifically trained and designed to take advantage of the terrain, just like Beastmen do, specialized in ambush warfare, just like the Beastmen do, and had their enemy both outgunned and outnumbered, just like the Beastmen do. If the Wood Elves, for instance, struggled to keep a much smaller space of land secure, despite having been there longer, know the lay of the land much better, can convince the forest itself to aid them in the battle, also specialize in ambush and counter-ambush warfare, and possess 2 living demigods who fight alongside them, exactly what chance do you think the likes of the Empire or Bretonnia has in gutting their forests? It's hard to put into words how dangerous the Warhammer world is, and how overwhelmed the nations of men are, and the forces of order, for that matter, are. The dwarves, the Empire, Bretonnia, all of the elves, the lizardmen, they are in constant war, essentially, because they are surrounded and grossly outnumbered by the likes of Beastmen, Greenskin, and Skaven. And that's just kind of the way the Warhammer world is. If the Empire were to completely unite under one banner, like Karl Franz completely united the Empire and led them on an epic crusade to purge the Beastmen, theoretically it could be done, but there's also another problem in that if you go completely whole hog in to defeat the Beastmen, you are going to have to leave some borders undefended. And that's when Chaos is going to strike, the Warriors of Chaos, or the Greenskins are going to invade, or the Skaven are going to come up and attack your undefended cities, or the Demons of Chaos are going to swoop down. Like, there are so many threats always present in the Warhammer world. It's just not realistically possible to send out, these great and powerful armies to wipe out the Beastmen. Because ultimately, you would have to try and lure the Beastmen out of the forest to fight you. And for the Empire at least, and Bretonnia, any of the human races, they would need to fight the Beastmen on open terrain. You can't fight them in the forest. They'll have the home field advantage. But the problem is there's too much forest. And you can't just go around cutting it all down because Beastmen specialize in ambush warfare. And you can't protect all the different places you're trying to expand out at once. And it would also take forever. And so it's just not feasible just due to the sheer scale of what they're up against. If the Empire wanted to even have a hope of defeating the Beastmen, basically what they would have to do is all of the northern provinces would have to not be allowed to engage. So like Nordland, Ostermark, or Ostland, and Kislev would all have to be immensely reinforced and make sure that no chaos could get through the border. On top of that, the southern parts of the Empire would have to be, like Averland, would have to be on their A game to make sure no greenskin hordes or anything are able to come through Blackfire Pass. And then the Empire would have to probably hire the help of the dwarves and the elves if they could get it, and very methodically clear out just patches of forest at a time, but it would take decades. And that's assuming the Beastmen don't use the Beast Paths, which are basically invisible hidden paths in the forest, to get behind you and just start propagating again. The Warhammer forests they're just too dangerous, especially the deepest, darkest places of them. You know, where you have herdstones and giant monoliths and warpstone comets that have mutated the local wildlife. It's just too dangerous of a world for that to really be feasibly possible outside of humanity reaching like a perfect zenith. And like completely uniting under one banner and just having like incredible technology, and probably also having an alliance with the other order races. Beastmen would be one of the most difficult races of chaos to destroy, next to the Skaven, just because there's so many of them, you know, and they specialize in ambushing and just all sorts of other nastiness. Hopefully that answers your question. I know for some people it might be difficult to fathom why you can't just go out and kick the crap out of them. It's just, there's too many of them, they're too powerful, and it's just too difficult. So hopefully that answers that in a satisfactory way. Let's go ahead and move on. Our next question comes from the Great Book of Grudges, who asks, do Beastmen have any relationship with other creatures that worship the Dark Gods, and what race do they most often ally? So any creature or being that worships the Dark Gods can at least stand a chance of striking a bargain or deal with a Beastman force, as many Chaos cultists and mutants tend to do this. However, Beastmen are quite an unruly and aggressive sort, so they don't really make the best allies. They tend to get a little too wild and will just sort of attack everybody. The only race that has even a decent track record with allying alongside the Beastmen are the Warriors of Chaos. And that's because they can kind of get more of like we're kind of working towards the same goal here, and the gods themselves will usually kind of be pushing the Beastmen to work alongside the Warriors. Plus, the Warriors of Chaos tend to travel in large enough hordes that they don't really care if the Beastmen kind of infight and also kill like maybe the occasional warrior or Norscan who gets caught out. That doesn't really matter to them. So that's why they're kind of able to make good allies. But everyone else, not really. Beastmen are just a little bit too unreliable for that. They're not great allies. Scion of the Emperor asks, how do Beastmen wrangle particular monsters to serve them as war beasts? I can see particularly powerful Bray shamans dominating the minds of some creatures, but the likes of manticores and particularly jabberslights seem even more prone to just mauling and eating anything that disturbs them. So you actually kind of hit it on the head. That's exactly how they do it. Bray shamans use rituals and their magic to dominate the minds of creatures like jabberslights and put the creatures on. They'll basically kind of aim the creature at the enemy. Often, in the case of a jabberslight, often what the Bray shamans will do is they'll wait until the battle begins, and then they will summon the jabberslight from its lair to come attack their enemy. Because they don't really want to risk it traveling with the herd unless there's something really important that they need a jabberslight for. Because jabberslights are incredibly difficult to control. So usually what they'll do is once the fighting starts, the Bray Shaman will kind of find the nearest one and lure it out by dominating its mind. Just kind of aim it in the right direction, let go, and hope for the best. Some creatures are kept with the Brayherds, but those tend to eat friendly beastmen until they're brought to bear on the enemy. Like Gorgons tend to do that. Gorgons you'll often find actually traveling with Brayherds, and they'll just sort of keep shoveling people into their mouths for their insatiable hunger, and the beastmen are just kind of like, whatever, we can take the losses. Unless it becomes bad enough. But there are some beast lords, for instance, that were noted to have the ability to just dominate creatures of the forest. There's been a number of them, like Gothor the Beast Lord. He was very famous for his ability to just, with his sheer willpower, get all these different kinds of beasts of the forest to just obey him. and do as he demands. There are a number of Beast Lords who have been blessed with that ability, or Doom Bulls, or even Great Bray Shamans. They're not super rare, moderately rare, but most of the time, if it's not the Beastmen captured it and are just sort of dragging along with them and they let it out of a cage and just hope for the best, it's usually a shaman either possessing its mind for the battle or possessing its mind at least until it gets to where they want it to go. Then they let it. Then they kind of release it. I will say though, all of these monsters and creatures certainly aren't trained or kept in cages, with the exception of manageable creatures like Tuskors, Razorgors, and Chaos Spawn. Those they totally keep in pens or cages and stuff of the sort. Outside of that, yeah, it's literally like a game of bowling, where the Bray Shaman will just sort of dominate the creature's mind and try and set them up, and then just let them go, and then the Beastmen will kind of do what they will. They have a very chaotic fighting style. The rare exception, of course, being a Beast Lord who's particularly gifted at strategy and is also able to control his monsters, which some of those exist. They have happened. Let's move on to the next question. Alright, our next question comes from Poor Manatee, who asks, were the Beastmen a common threat to the Tomb Kings when they were alive? Yes, very much so. The Beastmen are a threat to every nation on the planet, and the living empire of Nehekara was no exception to this rule. Yep, they definitely dealt with their fair share of Brayherds and other problems like that. Hope that answers your question. Moving on. Our next question comes from Cube, who asks, how are there so many Beastmen, and how are they capable of having such high numbers? Do they have females of their own, or is it all based on particular activities with regular humans? Alright, so the main thing for Beastmen is that they resupply through 4 primary methods. Number 1, the does of the Brayherd bear young quite regularly, that come from mating with the likes of Beast Lords and Doom Bulls and other prominent members. Beastmen will literally have orgies on a fairly regular basis, like because Morsalid, the Chaos Moon, is in a particular part of the sky, or maybe they just want to battle, or maybe they're just kind of romping around, or maybe there's some random ritual going on, or maybe the winds of magic are blowing particularly strong, so the Bray Shaman wants to do stuff. Beastmen have a ton of rituals, and many of these rituals have a portion of it that is almost solely dedicated to like fighting each other and then eating each other and whatever they can find and then screwing each other. And then they sleep and then they wake up and the herd starts moving again. And that's often where a lot of beast spawn, that's what Beastmen babies are called. They're called beast spawn, will be created. That's where most of them will come from. Number 2, human children that are born with mutations often are left out in the wilderness to die by their parents. Because although the Church of Sigmar kind of very expressly tells these parents they either need to turn their children into the authorities, so to speak, or they need to just kill the child. Like, if your child is born with a mutation, according to the Church of Sigmar and many of the churches, you have a duty as a parent to kill your child. And most people, understandably, do not have the strength of will or desire to do that. So instead of murdering their baby, they kind of try and cut for a middle ground. And what they'll do is they'll just sort of leave them out in the wilderness. Some people hoping they'll be picked up by the Beastmen and so they at least survive. And some people kind of hoping they just starve to death. Because many find it unpalatable to murder a baby, which is good because that's pretty disgusting. However, this is kind of bad in the Warhammer world because the Beastmen have a very keen sense of hearing when it comes to screaming babies. And it's very rare that a child that's been mutated is left out in the wilderness and the Beastmen don't find them. The Beastmen almost always find them, and they will immediately take them and claim them and take them back to the herd to be raised. And these children are known as Gaves, and Gaves have a very high position in Beastmen society because the Beastmen view them as actual gifts from the Dark Gods to help replenish the Warherd's numbers. Gaves have a pretty high chance to become pretty powerful. Unless they're just particularly weak, most of them tend to end up being pretty nasty creatures in the Brayherds. The third, number 3, is normal-born humans that become mutated, and they seek out the Brayherds to join either out of hatred for mankind or a desire to just survive. If you get a mutation in the Empire, you have to hide it, because if you don't and somebody finds out, they will torture you. They will torture you in horrible, horrible ways, and then you will be tied to a stake and burned to death. If you're a mutant and they catch you alive, you're almost always going to end up being burned alive. That's kind of like that's procedure. Most people who get too horribly mutated, what happens to them is they will flee for their lives and go live out in the forest and realize they don't have the skills to live out in the forest, especially with how dangerous it is. And so eventually they will either find or be found by the Beastmen, and the Beastmen will accept them into the war herd to bolster their numbers. That being said, Turnskins occupy like the lowest, absolute lowest totem pole in the Beastmen's ranks. You do not want to be a Turnskin. Like, you'll live, and they'll allow you to join the herd, but your life ain't going to be glamorous. And the fourth and final way that Beastmen tend to get more numbers is women who are captured by the Brayherds suffer a absolutely horrible fate that I will not go into detail with, but the results end up with more young for the herd. That's all I'm going to say on that. Between those 4 methods, the Beastmen actually have a surprisingly high rate of new bodies joining the Brayherds, which allows them to keep up their raids and such. It's also worth noting, though, that Beastmen don't tend to engage in open warfare against mighty armies, but instead rely on ambush warfare and raiding isolated villages until a particularly powerful Beast Lord, Doom Bull, or Great Bray Shaman rallies the herds together for an actual war. This means that they don't really suffer all that many losses on a regular basis like you would expect them to, like the Skaven or Greenskins tend to when they go in and fight. The Beastmen are quite a bit more cautious than most people give them credit for, which kind of saves them from just having like ridiculous amounts of casualties. Alright, I think our 12th question, if I've been counting correctly, comes from Orc Boss, who asks, how do humans of Chaos and the Beastmen interact when not in wartime? What about during wartime? Are there Beastmen in the far north who have adapted to colder climates? And if so, what are they like? Alright, so for your first question, Beastmen and Mortals of Chaos, or sometimes called Slaves to Darkness, sometimes called Warriors of Chaos, they hate one another and actively battle either to please the Chaos Gods, grow their own strength, or just alleviate boredom. During active campaigns, they will often be enemies, unless the Dark Gods command the Bray Shamans, for instance, through visions, to lead the Brayherds in a team-up, or a pact is struck between a Chaos Lord and Beast Lord. But generally, no, they don't like each other too much. The Warriors of Chaos tend to see the Beastmen as inferior to them, and kind of view them as competing for the glory of slaughter or what have you, whereas the Beastmen are pretty jealous of humanity, especially Chaos humans, and the fact that the Dark Gods actually like give them amazing gifts and rewards to try and basically purchase their souls. The Beastmen don't care for that much, so there's a lot of animosity there, but you know, they'll work together fairly often. As for the last question, yes, there are Beastmen literally everywhere, and thanks to the absurd amount of mutations that they tend to have, they are much like Greenskins in the sense that they can adapt to just about any environment. However, in the frigid northern realms, there is a particular subspecies of Beastmen called Ymir. These creatures have shaggy, all-white fur. Well, not all white, it tends to get a little yellowish the further down their body you go. And they stand a bit over 7 feet tall. They tend to weigh a bit over 300 pounds, and in addition to smelling terrible, They often will have just a bunch of chunks of rotting meat kept in their fur, which is usually frozen due to the weather, that they use as a snack, essentially, when hunting is going poorly or they don't have a good food supply. Unlike most beastmen, however, what makes the Yimmer pretty unique is that they're actually solitary creatures. Beastmen, of course, travel in herds. Yimmer travel alone. They only meet up to mate, usually. The Norskins, which Yimmer are primarily found in Norsca, Norskins really value hunting these types of beastmen as a trial, basically, to cross into manhood if the individual is particularly brave or foolish. But a Norskin who travels north and slays a beastman or a Yimmer is considered that's considered very impressive. That's considered very impressive. Our next question comes from Pizzy Friezo, who asks, since there is a story featuring tiger-headed beastmen from End, is there any information about various strains of beastmen from across the world? For example, I remember a map showing a large concentration of beastmen in Nagaroth, but do we know if they have something peculiar about them? Or maybe do you think the snake people in Koresh to be some kind of beastman race? So, beastmen are incredibly varied, no matter where they're found. But yes, their features tend to reflect the natural fauna found in their areas. This is why most beastmen bear similarities to goats and bulls, as the humans that existed when the Great Cataclysm occurred were closest to these beasts as they were in the earliest stages of developing like farming and ranching. This may lead to the suggestion that beastmen of exotic lands may appear notably different, though likely the typical variant of beastmen, like the goat-headed ones, can be found globally, as beastmen herds have wandered to all corners of the globe and intermixed. As for the tigermen of End, they may not exactly be beastmen. Details about them are scarce, but every minute detail matters, as they could be a specific subspecies, or they could be a subspecies of the beastmen like the Yimmer are. Or they might even just be bizarre creations of a lesser god found in that land. Sort of like how Ulrich has the children of Ulrich, which are a subspecies of human, essentially, that can take on a werewolf-like appearance. It's nearly impossible to say with a sufficient amount of detail, and I don't have the story in front of me. They could be any one of those things, so they could just be regular beastmen. They might be like Yimmer, where they're specific to that geography, or they could be any number of things. I don't know for certain about them. However, when it comes to the snake men of Koresh, we can say with certainty that they are not beastmen, as they have an actual civilization. Beastmen despise civilization in all its forms. The serpent men are a distinct species all of their own. They're more akin to the Skaven than they are to the Beastmen, if that makes sense, based on the earlier question we answered about Skaven. Hope that helps. Let's go ahead and move on. Josh G asks, do we know what happened to any notable Beastmen in the end times, or the Beastmen faction in general? So, for the in general part of the question, Beastmen participated greatly in the end times. They attacked all over the world as chaos waxed in the final Great War. Most of them perished when the world exploded, but they got to be on the winning side of that, and many were likely swept into the realm of chaos and continued on with the Dark Gods' other affairs until they, of course, landed in Age of Sigmar. Most of the Chaos champions, when the world kind of went kaboom, were basically, because the world was basically eaten into the realm of chaos and then exploded, which hurtled the core out into space with Sigmar holding onto it. So anything that was chaos aligned during that very likely was kind of just swept along as the Dark Brothers went on to some of their other games on other realities or planets, and just kind of took all those guys with them. That being said, when looking at particular, and the only reason I bother saying that is just because the answer is many of them survived, and they are a notable race in Age of Sigmar, so they made it. As for particular individuals, yes, we do know what happened to most of them. Some of them, like Moonclaw and Slugtongue, for instance, we have no idea what happened to them. They didn't show up. I guess they were considered too minor. But here's the ones we do know about. Malagor the Dark Omen. Malagor was killed by the new Supreme Patriarch, the one who replaced Gelt when he left, named Gregor Martark, who at that point was infused with the power of Ulrich, so he, had the god of winter inside of him and was able to use this really powerful magic that was a combination of amber magic and ice magic. And using that combination of spells, Malagor had basically gone crazy in the end times. After he gathered a big bunch of warherds together, joined up with Archaon, and invaded in the final siege of Middenheim, the final battle. Malagor was flying around casting spells like crazy, and was basically just on the front lines being a madman. And he was flying around, and Gregor Martark put an end to him and got in a final shot where he unleashed basically these spears of ice magic that impaled Malagor and killed him. Khazrak the One-Eye died during the end times, just before the siege of Middenheim. He died dueling Boris Todbringer in the Drakewald, because Boris had also gone a little crazy during the end times, and he was convinced that the harbinger of the end times was Khazrak, not Archaon. So he thought that if he rode out into the forest and killed Khazrak, that he would save everyone, which of course was not at all the case. But Boris had kind of lost it by that point. So he gathered up a bunch of knights, rode out, and Khazrak knew he was coming. And Khazrak ambushed him very successfully and basically wiped out Boris's entire contingent, and then fought Boris in a duel, because Khazrak, is honorable as far as beastmen go. And the two of them had a very epic confrontation. It was one of the better parts of that book. And at the end of it, Boris managed to kill Khazrak. He slew him in single combat, which of course then immediately afterwards, because he was surrounded by Khazrak's war herd, Boris was promptly absolutely torn apart and died. But, he at least got to kill Khazrak in the end. Taurux the Brass Bull. So this is the Doom Bull special character. If you've never heard of him, he's a Doom Bull that's covered head to toe in brass armor and is very scary. And if you can't tell, he's very Khorne aligned. He was slain during the fall of Altdorf. Basically, when the fighting was on the outskirts still, a bunch of special characters were involved in the chaos rush for the walls and the gates. And one of them was Taurux the Brass Bull, who was just cleaving through things and people. And he was killed by an absolutely miraculous shot fired by Marcus Wolfhart, who is the Scoutmaster of the Empire and a legendary monster hunter. If you want to know more about Marcus, you can go to my Future of the Empire video, and there's a thing about him in there. But Taurux, something Taurux was very famous for, both on tabletop and in the lore, is that he was covered head to toe in this nearly impenetrable brass armor, except for a very small spot at the base of his neck. So like right in that sweet spot, he had nothing there. That was his one weakness. And Marcus Wolfhart, being the absolute badass archer that he is, fired an arrow and hit Taurux right in the money shot. Just nailed him right in his weakness. Kind of like Bard shooting Smog. It was basically a similar situation to that. And Taurux just went down. Like he was out. So that's how Taurux died. Another fairly famous character who died was a beastman known as the Harbinger of the Beast, who I mentioned earlier in this video. The Harbinger was a particularly famous Great Bray Shaman who was noted for summoning demons. He specialized in demonology magic. He played a massive role in summoning a notable part of the army that attacked Altdorf during the fall of Altdorf. He was a major player in Gutrot Spum's spur, I guess I'll call it. There were three armies that attacked Altdorf at the same time, and each was led by a champion of Nurgle. One was led by the Glottkin, one was led by the Magath Lords, and the Glottkin had all the Warriors of Chaos. The Magath Lords had some new cool guys and a bunch of demons, and then Gutrot Spume led the last one, who's the Lord of Tentacles. You can look him up, he has a cool model. And he had the help of the Harbinger, so his army comprised a lot of Beastmen. In any event, so the Harbinger participated in the invasion, and he managed to get into the city and was basically chasing down Gregor Martark. And this is before Gregor went to Middenheim and fought there. And because Gregor Martark died in the final siege of Middenheim. But he was in Altdorf, and he's the Supreme Patriarch at the time because Gelt had left. And he was noted, he was a very, very powerful Amber Wizard. And he was being pursued, and he was horribly outnumbered, and the Harbinger is a terrifyingly powerful wizard. So what Martark did is that he led the Harbinger into the Imperial Zoo, kind of on a wild goose chase, because the Harbinger really wanted to kill him. And so the Harbinger pursued him into the zoo, where the Harbinger kind of thought was funny because he kind of held the advantage with all those beasts around. They kind of put them on even footing. But he had a bunch of troops with him, and he pursued them until he cornered them in the depths of the Imperial Zoo, which, unknown to the Harbinger, he had actually been led into a trap. Because as all the Beastmen ran to the chamber, their smell woke up the Imperial Dragon, who was also being prodded heavily by Martark's magic to wake up. And when he woke up, he basically turned and just incinerated the Harbinger and all of his Beastmen, and they all just died instantly. And that's how the Harbinger died. Gothor the Beast Lord is another Beastman special character. He's not end times related. Just if you're wanting to know the roster, Gothor the Beast Lord died ages ago. He is a really good story. If you ever had the chance to read it, I would call it an epic. Gothor was a very well written Beastman character. He was kind of the Gorbad Ironclaw of the Beastmen in many ways. The final one, I'm pretty certain Goros Warhoof showed up in the fall of Altdorf. He either showed up in the fall of Altdorf or he showed up in the final battle for Athel Loren. I don't remember which one it was, but he died. He did die whichever one he did show up to, but I can't 100% remember which one he was there, but he did show up. Which, for those of you who don't know Goros Warhoof, he's the father of 1,000 sons. He has a regiment of renown in Total War Warhammer, which is the Centaur unit that has Guardian. They're represent his children. Whenever he shows up to a battlefield, he's terrifying because he has like a whole bunch of Centaurs with him, and they're all his kids. He is the father of 1,000 young, and that's according to the lore, that's a very understated number of how many kids he's had. But hopefully that answers that question. Let's go ahead and move on. Heading towards the end here, we've got Jawala Lilu, who asks, for the Beastmen, what would be some of the monsters that a Beastman army would field besides the known ones, such as Cygors, Gorgons, Giants, and Jabberslights? So there are a myriad of strange and horrific creatures to be found lurking in the depths of the forest. I'm not going to mention every single one I can think of. I'm just going to mention a couple of them that are more realistically expected to see in a Beastman army. But, I mean, there are literally some that are so vague that you can open the Beastman book and it literally refers to a many-tentacled creature from bogs that eats men whole. And that's all they say about it. That will be found in Brayherds. But I'll talk about some of the interesting ones. So the first one, an incredibly rare creature that can be found exclusively in Bretonnia, fighting alongside the Beastmen, is a hate-filled monster called the Praeton. They have the appearance of a great stag from a distance, and many people have attempted to hunt this clever beast, thinking it was, you know, a normal creature of grandeur, and it lures you deeper and deeper into the forest until you're in its domain, and there it'll spring into sudden violence. And when it gets close to you, you notice that it has scaled flesh, sharp fangs. Many of them have wings of a sort that don't really let them fly, but sort of leap or glide, kind of similar to Jabberslights. and they will tear people apart limb from limb. And they are incredibly violent creatures, to the extent that what's very famous about them and how you can tell you're in their territory if you haven't seen one yet is that whenever they kill something, they won't stop. They'll just keep tearing it apart for like minutes, if not hours, because they are so angry, and the only thing that seems to bring them any relief is pain, either them causing it or feeling it. And if they kill something, they'll just go nuts, tearing it apart with their horns and claws and everything. And the reason is kind of found in their backstory. The Brayherds' creation is very tragic. They were once great stags, the kinds of creatures, the types of regal creatures that only like the most noble of wood elf warrior kings would ride into battle. And they represented the majesty of everything that could be found in nature. However, some of them fell victim to the predations of the Beastmen, which, upon capturing these creatures, instead of killing them or eating them or sacrificing them, the Bray Shamans did something worse. They used a horrific ritual to mutate the stags into beings that were more pleasing to the eyes of the dark gods. So they essentially twisted their forms until they were to great stags what beastmen are to men. And unfortunately for Brayherds, they can still remember what they used to be as a species, which is why they're so full of anger and rage and self-loathing. And they're very tragic creatures, but they are incredibly dangerous. They're like much stronger than trolls. Like they're monsters. You know, they're not small. They're big and scary. The next one that comes to mind are things called hag trees. So these titans of bark and all sorts of maggots and rotted leaves and all sorts of just gross filth can be found in the dark heart of the world's forests. These abominations, which were once great and mighty oaks or what have you, a tree of that land, have essentially become twisted and gnarled by dark magic and loads of warpstone. Often, when the Beastmen find these things, they will consider them sacred sites and set up kind of a permanent camp, and they will adorn these trees, their branches, with the corpses of those sacrificed in horrific rituals for the pleasure of the dark gods. So you'll have all these people who died in horrible agony and pain and suffering, hung many times alive from the trees. And the legends go further. Legends speak of how some of these monolithic trees possess the ability to move, gnarled roots dragging them towards the nearest prey to join those already hung dead from iron-hard branches, or to be shoveled by these twisting roots into great gaping maws to be devoured alive by rotten fangs made of bark and bone. Hag trees are essentially just ultimate culminations of corruption. Like they're kind of like Morgar, but put into the form of a tree, very big tree. They're not like forest spirits in that they have like limbs and are bipedal and move like that. No, it's more like literally a giant tree that just drags itself. And they're horrific, absolutely horrific. And any story that a hag tree shows up in is not a pleasant one. The last one that I'll talk about are these creatures called war fiends. They are easily one of the creatures I know the least about, but have enough details to at least talk about them. War fiends are used exclusively by the herd of the Jagged Horn, which can be found near the Middle Mountains. These large beasts are only used to transport the herd's warriors quickly across large swaths of land, which allows the herd of the Jagged Horn to have a pretty wide hunting ground, much larger than most beast herds do, because they ride on mounts to get to places, but these things are huge. However, the Beastmen don't actually use them in battle. And the reason is because the Beastmen don't really have them trained, and they don't trust them to behave in a fight. So while the War Beasts or the War Fiends are used by Beastmen, they're only used as transports. They're not used as weapons because Beastmen don't have the ability to control them, and they're not useful enough to expend like a Brayherds mind controlling them or dominating them. It's easier just to leave them behind. The herd of the Jagged Horn, tends to fight on foot always. There's even just a note about that they fight unmounted, but they like to use those things to get around. So hopefully that answers that. A couple of interesting creatures for you, if nothing else. Our next question comes from Sotek Snake God, who asks, have the Beastmen made a massive invasion in Lustria at any point in history? No, not a notably massive invasion, no. They certainly have a presence in Lustria and attack the Lizardmen quite often. In the rare event of a Chaos invasion coming south, such as the infamous incursion of Vashnar the Tormentor, the Beastmen will always join up to unleash their wrath on the Lizardmen. They certainly attack fairly often, but most Beastmen are contained in Nagaroth and are busy there. They don't tend to come that far south, at least not in great enough numbers to form a truly devastating war herd. That being said, it is quite likely there have been some very massive herds that have attacked Lustria, different parts of it all over, but none of them were large enough to warrant Games Workshop creating a story about it. So we don't have any details of anything like that. Presumably it has happened, but if it has, there's not enough notes for it to be worth the details. I'll put it that way. So the short answer is no. Let's go ahead and move on. Alright, so the last two questions I'm going to combine because they're basically about the same subject, which are from Megaru32 Sama and Dakalwar. And both their questions are essentially asking, they're essentially asking some more details about female Beastmen. Megaru asking if any of them are particularly powerful, like became Beast Lords or anything like that, or Wargors, or famous warriors, while Dakalmore's question is more for kind of what their roles are. So Does, which are going to be the main focus of this, do not have a warrior or shamanistic role in Beastman society. They're pretty much just breeders that travel around with the herds and keep their numbers up. Does are pretty shy on average. Like they exist, but they're not nearly as violent or aggressive as their male counterparts. So no, you wouldn't really see them as a warrior or a shaman or anything like that requires them to take a leading role in Beastman society. Now, going back to a conversation we had earlier, where we talked about the Turnskins and the Gaves, it is there could be a mutant or a Gave or something who ends up being a female that joins a Brayherd, but the likelihood of them getting beyond being the equivalent of a doe is very unlikely. And that's because Beastmen only care about strength. They don't give a damn about cunning most of the time. There are, of course, minor exceptions. But they usually don't give a damn about cunning. They don't give a damn about how smart you are. What they really care about is how strong you are. If you can't win challenges, then you cannot lead the herd. Like when a war herd's about to do something big, like attack a human city or something, the Bray Shamans will gather all of the nearby herds, and basically one of the Wargors will come up and say, I'm going to be Beast Lord of this herd. And the Bray Shamans will basically be like, okay, does anyone want to challenge him for command of the herd? And then he'll have to meet challengers until no one else is willing to challenge him. And it's a fight to the death, most of the time. And even shamans, if shamans have disagreements, they will have duels unleashing magic and usually flinging their spirits at each other in the etheric realm, which is usually to very devastating effect for everyone nearby. Female beastmen would not be able to survive in those circumstances because female beastmen are very notably physically smaller, weaker, and less aggressive than their male counterparts. So the chance of one of them becoming a champion or a wargore or a bestigore or a beast lord is just impossible. It's not like the Warriors of Chaos where you have women who can use their, even though they're different from men and men can be physically stronger than them on average, you can still have exceptions, or you can still have women who, through other means like skill, like Valkia the Bloody, ended up becoming favorites of the gods and stuff like that. Tons of female notable Warriors of Chaos. No, Beastmen, the females of their race are pretty strictly denoted to just breeding, and that's it. Which is a little boring, I'm sure, for some people, but that's just the way the Beastmen are. They're just a very aggressive, all about constantly fighting and eating and defecating on everything. One of the weirdest things when you read the Beastmen book is reading the sheer amount of text that's dedicated to explaining how much the Beastmen will shit and piss on everything. Everything. They're disgusting, filthy, vile creatures, which is why I love them. But in any event, hopefully that answers your questions. A lot of people asked about female Beastmen, and the long and short of it is just they're called does. They do exist, but they are shy, physically smaller, and physically less powerful, and notably less aggressive than their male counterparts. Like, if you're wandering the forest and for some magical reason you ran into a doe, you would not necessarily be in danger. A doe would be more likely to flee than to fight. Whereas if you ran into a gore in the forest, you better hope you're really good fighting, because otherwise you're fucked. Especially because beastmen, on average, are more powerful than men. They are very scary. So anyway, hope that answers your question on that. Well, that does it for this Q&A video. I hope you all enjoyed. I do want to take a minute to thank my patrons who make all of this pretty much possible and help me be able to make videos on a regular basis. In particular, I want to give a special shout out to Michael, Sign of the Emperor, and Justin the Demigriff for their very substantial support. They make a significant impact, and I appreciate y'all's dedication to helping me out and making sure that we can keep things going around here. In any event, thank you all for watching. Our next video is going to be, our next Q&A I should say, is going to be over Norsca. That is who won the vote from the patrons. So if you have any questions you would like answered about Norsca or anything related to Norsca, all you have to do is leave the question either down in the comment section below. You can leave it on the Q&A page of my Discord, or you can even tweet the questions at me if you'd like over on Twitter. If you are a patron, either you can just leave your questions in the community tab on Patreon, and that'll work as well. So in any event, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to answering all your questions about Norsca. And I hope you're a little bit more informed about the Beastmen. In any event, have a great day, and I will see you guys around. Thanks for watching. Bye.